then Brunswick. The family were quite close, as her father, who was a captain with the Royal Dutch Merchant Marines, would be away from home for 4 years at a time. He sent many postcards to his family from Indonesia and Egypt. Perhaps my mom inherited her wanderlust from her father. After a few years, the family, including her sister Marie and younger brother Leo, moved to The Hague, where she spent the majority of her youth. Coby became a second sister to her Aunt Annie, who was only 10 years older than herself. In the late 1930s, Coby started her trade as a hairdresser. She became the main source of income to the family during the Second World War, as her father was forced to serve his shifts under the watchful eyes of the Germans. I have to slow down. And her brother went into hiding. Coby's salon clientele included performers and prostitutes, who became very valuable assets during the war because they paid with food and silk stockings, which could be traded for food. The war was very difficult for anyone who lived in the big cities in Holland. Jews were hiding in the neighborhood, and everyone could only watch as the families that were hiding them were arrested with the Jews. As the war dragged on, there was less fuel and less food for heating. A young boy was hung in the street for stealing some bread. Coby and her sister Marie had to hide from the German soldiers while stealing parts of a tree that had been bombed. And saddest of all, a cousin of hers that disappeared because he was out after curfew. During the Hunger Year, her mother and sister became quite ill. My mom rode her bike that had no tires at that time and went to work on distant farms to return home with butter, eggs, and potatoes. When she was stopped by a German officer who promptly confiscated her food. Mom was never afraid to speak her mind. She protested and was promptly put in a labor camp for 30 days. Undeterred, she went back to the farms and dug for whatever potatoes she could find in the wet, cold mud. When she arrived home, her father's comment was, "Is that all you got?" Towards the end of the war, my mother, grandmother, and Aunt Annie went to South Holland to look for work and food. My mother could speak fluent French and German. Riding the trains without permits, my mom would distract the soldiers until the soldiers found out the family didn't have papers, and they were kicked off the train in Eindhoven. The three slept in lice-ridden haylofts on farms. My grandmother said they became so full of lice that the lice should be carrying them back into town. By 1945, the 1st Canadian Army liberated that part of Holland, and it was there where Coby met up with Private Homer Waldren. Communication was a challenge because they could only speak French together, and my dad's French, which he picked up in northern Alberta, wasn't real French, according to my mom. After the war, my father went to Normandy, France, to guard the Canadian War Cemetery. He continued his relationship with my mom for the next year. In 1948, Wally's time in the Army ended, and he was shipped home to Canada. After he got a job as a guard at the Lethbridge Provincial Jail, he sent for my mother. She came over by ship to Montreal and then took the train to Lethbridge. My father had her set up in a beach shack on the old jail road until they were married a month later. In 1949, son Robbie was born. Times were tight for them. For her first Christmas, Coby needed to decide between receiving an alarm clock and a lipstick. Anyone who knew my mother knew she went nowhere without her lipstick, so we know how that turned out. In 1949, Coby went back to work as a hairdresser. Her English naturally improved. And finally, in 1955, she built and opened up Coby's Beauty Salon on 13th Street North, which was her main shop until she retired. But over the years, she owned many other salons and became interested in fashion retail. She opened the Cinderella Clothing across from Galt Gardens in 1958. She expanded her North Side salon to include the Lethbridge Beauty School, and many of her students became her employees. Later, she added Coby's Tiny Tots and Ladies Fashions to the North Side. She also ran and owned the Beauty School of Elegance on 7th Street South. Coby ran a true family business. My father was known as Mr. Coby. My brother was the receptionist, and myself taking on turns as young as 6. Always enterprising, in the early 1960s, she bought the first of many of the rental properties that she bought and sold over the years. Wally died in 1970, just 2 months short of his retirement. My mom was glad to have her many businesses and properties to occupy her time. Coby enjoyed having her mother and father staying with her many months at a time in the 50s and 60s. In 1958, she sponsored her brother Leo and his wife Monica and their daughter Barb to become Canadian citizens and Lethbridge residents. After Leo died in 1964, she helped his family in many ways. She loved her cars and driving fast. I remember so many things. We were always late going to church. That's when she really drove fast. Coming home from the salon in sub-zero temperatures in her strange German DKW car, we'd have to scrape the ice off of the inside of the windows as the car whined and protested in the cold. Going on vacations in a gorgeous 1964 Ford Galaxy, Lorraine and I sitting in the back with the top down and listening to the radio pumping out the music, her big showy Mercedes 450 XL and her splashy Lincoln. Trailers, travel vans, motorhomes, anything to get her on the road to a new adventure. And anyone was welcome to come along. Finn, George, Frankie, Lois, Marlene, Hanukkah, and of course the dogs, Shanty and Gigi. Her travel van found space to sleep 7, even if it only had a capacity for 4. Her holidays to the States, especially Hawaii, were frequent. She liked nothing better than sitting on a rock and listening to the ocean waves as it hit the shore. There would also be a visit to Holland almost every year to visit family and her precious Aunt Annie, and to feast on delicious leckerbeckens, delicious fake-meat fish. Finally, she retired, selling her business in 1980. Now she had grandchildren to take on trips with her to Montreal, California, Fairmont Hot Springs, or just nearby Park Lake in her motorhome. Coby started to travel more extensively through the States with Ben Miller, then George Vickers in her motorhome, and later her travel van and 20-foot trailer. Finally, in 1986, she discovered the perfect place, a beautiful retreat in the desert, Sky Valley Park near Palm Springs, California. She purchased a park model and resided there for 25 winter seasons. After George passed away, she made the long drive to and from California by herself until she was 87. By 92, her failing eyesight forced her to give up her driver's license for a temporary license. Undeterred, she took driving lessons. By the end of her first lesson, her instructor phoned me and said she wouldn't be getting her license back. Nevertheless, she continued to drive a car in Sky Valley. She became an avid bridge and cricket player and was seen often at the senior center and never lacked for partners. If life was too slow, there was always a casino. She started with playing roulette and then later poker and blackjack became her favorites. She was a careful gambler and quite lucky. My mother was also generous. Her doors were always open to friends and family. Some stayed for weeks, some stayed for months. Animal causes were always in her heart. She would knit wool blankets for homeless dogs and cats so they would have something warm to sleep on. She threw food in the alley for stray cats and left heating pads on the deck so they had somewhere warm to sleep in the winter. She had a soft spot for the homeless as well. She gave money to people on the street. After she was told not to because they would just buy a bottle, her answer would be, if it makes them happy. Being happy and making people happy is what she lived for. Our house on DF was always full of people on the weekends, playing cards, having a drink, dancing to very loud music, and just having a few laughs. In her later years, Coby became known as the tough old bird. One of my favorite memories is Mom at St. Teresa Villa, where she lived her last few years. The caregivers had told Mom she wasn't allowed in the hallway without a wheelchair because of the danger that she might fall. As I was leaving her, she grabbed her walker, shaking both ways down the hallway to make sure no one was out there. She boldly broke the rules, walked me out to the front door with her walker. Never tell Mom she couldn't do something. She would get that twinkle in her eye and just show you she could. And she did, because she was always very stubborn. The Dutch word for that is eindgewees. She was almost 95 when she went to sleep and never woke up. That is what she would have wanted. What a life well lived.